Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give it a minute or so just to let a few more join. There's quite a lot of folks registering and entering the webinar at the moment, so I'll just give it a few seconds. But I want to thank you all for joining. We've set this webinar up because it is an issue and a topic that we get questions about daily, and we thought it was probably time to start providing a little bit of advice and giving some guidance to some organisations to answer some of those tricky questions. So we'll get started. You've got both Nicholas Goncharov and myself today, so it should be an interesting one. So we're going to cover a lot of the questions we get, and it really is quite a practical presentation. So we're going to start off, and we're talking about effectively data governance, and that for us, in a realistic sense, means it means protecting that customer and company data. That's what it means. For us, data governance is at our core. It means those things. It's protecting the data throughout its life, and understanding the data throughout its life. We've seen over the last probably 5 or 10 years, but really quite acutely over the last 2 or 3, some significant changes in the landscape, in the data landscape, and that's brought about through a number of factors, which you can see there. The first is regulation. We're seeing a real need and desire by the public and enforcement by regulators to protect privacy and look after our data. That's particularly where it comes to customer data. Importantly, and Nick's going to talk a bit more about this later, but we've seen just an entire explosion in the amount of data out there, and that's really in all spaces. We see it throughout the internet, and we see it in organisations in the amount of data that they're simply storing because it's easy. When talking about that, we talk about the cloud, and a client of ours said to me only a few weeks ago that they'd been encouraged to go off on-premises data storage to cloud storage because it'll be much easier to expand. In fact, they used the word elastic, and that's great, but they weren't at that point. They are now, but they weren't at that point dealing with the issues of what were they actually storing, and they didn't really know. I think we've all seen increases in cyber attacks. We deal with cyber attacks all the time in SECMON1. It is damaging. We see lots of data being lost on a daily basis, and one of the frightening things is many organisations don't really understand in those first few hours of the data breach what's been lost. So that does cause a lot of anxiety for organisations. And we'll talk about integration into other programs, but in particular into data loss. It's very difficult to understand what data is leaving the organisation or moving around the organisation when you don't know what the data is. So some of those factors make it really important that we start to get a handle on what are we dealing with. So I'll throw to you, Nick, just in relation to some of the important stuff here.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So this is a slide about sort of the average customer and what the data, this sort of data profile is. When we go in there and we look at their environment and see what they're storing and where they're storing it, it typically looks like this, where the company will have a lot of stale accounts, so people have left the organisation, and their data's still around. They may have left 5-10 years ago. All their data that no one really knows about anymore is sitting there. And in addition to having huge amounts of data that's 10, 20 plus years old, which we call rot or redundant, obsolete and trivial data. So often around 60%, almost 2/3 of the data that organisations are storing actually falls under this category, which is representing some risks to the organisation, but not really providing any value. In addition, the average organisation has over 1,000 sensitive files exposed to all employees. So we often see things sitting on open file shares. There's not really good controls around that, and really essentially it's open access. So the average customer has around 500,000 sensitive files, and 20% of those are actually accessible by every employee. So it's actually represents quite a significant risk. In addition, there's a lot of open folders, over 100,000 open folders. The average employee has access to over 17 million files, right? So basically, organisations storing a lot of data, and employees have pretty much open access to a lot of this really sensitive data. So you go to the next slide, Chris.
Sure.
Now, obviously, with different industries, your data profile is going to look a bit different. So if you're in, say, energy and utilities, you're probably going to be storing data about your customers. You might have internal information about pricing and deals and contracts with suppliers, and also potentially blueprints of national infrastructure, so quite highly sensitive things. Whereas on the health side, where you might be in a healthcare organisation, you're going to be storing customer information. If you need to make an insurance claim, they're going to collect things like your doctors, your bill from your doctors, or medical reports and things like that. Highly sensitive data, right? And so the data that each organisation holds is different, but there's a common theme here that every organisation does hold some sort of sensitive data. And also, on average, we see that around 20% of that sensitive data is essentially exposed, right, to open access to all employees. So it's something that organisations, I think, really need to be mindful of, that this risk probably exists it does exist in the average organisation. We do need to be mindful of that and put in some controls to protect that data.
Mm. That's we're actually seeing those numbers increase, aren't we, Nick? So as the data stores increase really unfettered, we're seeing those numbers increase on a daily basis. So we had some ages of files a few weeks ago of a job we're doing that were 20 years old, were they?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
It's obviously data that's 20 years old, it can't really be any value you wouldn't have thought. Let's talk about the journey, and it's important that it is a journey and not a one-off engagement. When we often see one-off engagements, people want to do that server, look at this server, what's on there, because they've had a data breach and they just want to do that one reactive piece of work, and that's fine, and then we need to do that sometimes. But it is important that this work around data sensitivity and data governance is a complete journey, and it's something that we need to keep doing. And it starts off with we call it maturity, but that's often in the first when we start talking to an organisation, we call that scoping. So what do you want to do? What's the objectives? Are you regulated? Are you not regulated? Where do you want to be? What's the scope of this particular data governance journey for you? And it'll start with policy. Now, we'll all have policy. I'm sure there's a dusty data classification policy sitting on the shelf there somewhere. But the issue for us is do all the staff understand what the data classification means? And most people, honestly, probably don't. But there's also other policies such as data destruction policies and all of these things that that come into play. And Nick will talk about this a bit further in a little while. But data destruction is really critical, making sure that data that you've got keeps moving on. It keeps being destroyed, because it is a significant risk if it's not. Another part of it is discovery, and when we start talking to an organisation, it's often we'll do a very widespread, enterprise-wide discovery to find all of the data, and then start to work with the organisation to collapse it down to make sure it's to make sure we've remediated what we're finding that's in risk. Now, we find a lot of organisations, there's a little bit of anxiety when they start to think about data governance or the data that's in share drives and mailboxes and SharePoint and so forth. But we often find that 90% of the data is very easy to remediate. It's quite simple. Then you've got probably 10%, which is okay. We've got to make some decisions. There might be a business process feeding some data into a particular area. Might have to switch a couple of things, but in the main, there's some really big wins to have by doing some discovery and remediation, or protection, as we call it sometimes as well. So get the data into areas where we know it's protected, and some of these things are where it could be a DBA, a database administrator, it could be someone working with large data sets will take some data, manipulate it, and put a copy on their desktop or on a share drive or somewhere else, and those sorts of things. And this is where you start to get that data sprawl and data duplication and all those sorts of issues. Once you understand what the data is in your organisation, then we can start to integrate it. And this is where you really get the power of understanding data and where it is and what it is. And so we commonly will integrate the fact that we understand what the data is with things such as data leakage protection, or a CASB, a cloud access security broker, these sorts of technologies. So you can really understand it and leverage great gains and great power from that first initial foundational work of understanding what the data is. Compliance is critical. So we talked a little bit about regulation a few minutes ago. Compliance with regulation is for organisations which might have finance data, healthcare data, or any customer data is really critical, because you are at this stage probably compelled to do something with the data anyway. So it's great to get that tick in the box and understand how you are complying, and be confident to go to the regulator if you're regulated, and make sure that you can assure them that we are compliant. But it's also being regulated is great. That's one reason. But the other reason is as we'll talk about in a couple of slides, having your sensitive or just your company data protected and understood, and in some order is a very healthy thing for lots of reasons operationally as well. Monitoring, once we know what we've got, why we're doing it, we can start to monitor for it and start to do things proactively. And what that does is lead on to the last step, which is of course changing the culture in the organisations. And we see this happen organically. It means that you can feed what we now know into programs such as security awareness. So rather than just being hit and miss with security awareness, you can actually feed messages to the organisation in various layers. It could be via a pop-up, it could be via a poster, it could be many methods, but you can start to feed messages, real messages, back to the staff. And for us, that means two things: that the message has to be timely, and it's got to be relevant. So it's got to be timely, it's got to mean something right now, and it's got to be relevant to that user at that time. And that's why we tend to lay our communications. But we see big gains in culture change. So some of the reasons around why is data governance and DLP, why is it important? And some of these questions are critical, and we know this stuff, but it is really it is critical to understand what sensitive data are we storing, and where are we storing it. These are security 101 questions. Who's got access to the data, and what are they doing with it? So these are the 4 questions that you really need to ask yourself. And if you think you don't have a handle on that, it's probably time to ask why don't we have a handle on that, and what can we do to get a handle on that? And there's many ways to do that, which we'll talk about in a minute. Benefit wise, it's for all of the various levels and various departments in the organisation, because data is an organisational problem. Obviously, it's not a CIO or a CISO's problem. It's an organisational challenge. It's an organisational aspect of the business to get a handle on. But for InfoSec, data breaches are a key challenge. It's something that CISOs and CIOs stay awake at night thinking about. But when you understand where the data is and you can remediate and protect it, you can then very quickly start to prevent those inadvertent data breaches. And most data breaches are as a result of inadvertent activity by users. So when you get that, you've protected the data, plus you wrap in the culture sides of it, you start to get a really good security culture building in the organisation. And of course, you're reducing the sensitive data that you've got a hold of. So the data Nick was talking about before, which was 20 years old, it was still sensitive data. If it had been breached, it would still, probably result in a report to the Privacy Commissioner. But it was of no value operationally to the business anymore. So that's the sort of things we need to think about. For senior management, for the execs, it allows them to start to make some informed decisions operationally. They can leverage opportunities with confidence because they understand what they've got and where it is. And of course, it increases the efficiency of the business overall. For legal, the legal and compliance, there's those constant issues of complying with regulation and understanding how they should comply. But for us also, we do a lot of legal discovery matters. And when an order is made to produce some information, instead of having to look through petabytes of data sometimes, you can reduce that cost. For finance love this stuff because it means they can do some accurate reporting, and it also means that their cost of their storage comes down, which is also pretty important, obviously. If we don't get a handle on our data, it's obviously we start to see, at worst case scenario, loss of client confidence if there's a data breach, or if you're not sure about what information you store about a particular customer, they quickly lose confidence. Competitive edge, we see organisations that can move quickly because they have a good data governance program. We see that they can move forward very fast and with confidence. So obviously there's decreased operational efficiency, potential sanctions and fines if there's a data breach, and of course reputation and financial damage. Not having a good handle on your data governance is like trying to drive along honestly with your handbrake on in the car. That's sort of what it's like. I'll throw you, Nick, in relation to some of the technology aspects.
Sure. So as you might have picked up on, it's data governance and just data discovery it's a big task, a big challenge to take on. So we need the right technology in place, and there's many solutions out there available in the market, but it's important to make sure that you get the right technology for your organisation. So this might depend on the data you're trying to find, whether it's in a certain location. Different tools have different abilities to connect to different targets. It might be the type of data that you want to find, and it might be that you may already have some sort of capability already that's implemented in your organisation that you're not making full utilisation of. So often, we've come to an organisation where they already have the tool sitting there, and they may be using 10% of the value of that tool. We really come in and crank that up and make sure they're getting the full potential out of it. There's a word of warning with some software vendors marketing their product is, I guess, where you can just tick a box and hit run, and the solution will find everything and solve all your compliance problems. There's a bit more to it than that. There's technology is only one piece of it. You also need the right people with the right processes behind it as well.
You're suggesting, Nick, there's no magic tools?
No, there's not. So, you need the processes, procedures. We need things like data classification frameworks and policies, data handling standards. They're all really important part of the puzzle. To getting things right.
we'll talk a bit about discovery.
Yeah. So when we do a discovery, data can be, as we mentioned, in a lot of different places, and here's some examples of what that might look like. Could be on your Windows desktops and laptops, on your servers, your file shares. It could be on premise, could be in the cloud, so in your Office 365, in your Dropbox, in Azure, Amazon AWS. Could be in databases, right? And it could be in all sorts of different file types. So from your Office documents, PDFs, images, all sorts of things, right? And all different sorts of data. So every organization is going to have their own data profile and data that they're going to want to find, right? So important thing is here to have the right, as we said, the right capability, depending on what you need to do in your environment, and also a tool that is flexible enough to be able to modify to find exactly what you are looking to find. So it's as we talked previously, there's the average organization has millions and tens and hundreds of millions of files, right? So it's really we need the technology in place to be able to allow us to do the discovery on all these different targets and data types. And this example of a dashboard from one piece of technology that we use, and you can get an idea of the sort of visibility that you can start to get in your environment. So if you look at the sort of the graph in the middle, where you've got this red and green area increasing. So as we start to discover the data in the environment, so we're looking for their specific sensitive data, you can see the red starting to increase. So that's essentially the unprotected data in the environment. And then as we start to remediate, we start to protect and reduce that sensitive data footprint, we see that turn green. So we can see over time that our sensitive data footprint actually reduces, and our security posture increases significantly in protecting the sensitive data that we have on hand. And we can see things like what classification our data is, what's actually contained, how much PII data do we have, where is it stored. We can start to answer some of those really important questions that Chris was talking about before, right? Because how do we protect the data if we actually don't know what that data is and where that data is? This is sort of really the first step in that journey to really getting a strong foothold in what your data actually looks like. The next thing, once we've discovered data, we can classify the data. So there's many benefits of that. We can essentially put tags on the metadata of files, so they stay with the file as they move around the organization. This is great because if you look on the right side of the screen there, you can see there's some overlays, and there's a little icon in the top right of each file. Some look like a credit card, some look like a person, and this gives the users essentially a visual indicator to say, okay, this file, without even having to open the file, they already know that there's sensitive data sitting in these files and what type of sensitive data that is, so they can make appropriate decisions when sharing that data, for example. We can also then integrate these classifications with your other security technology, so your DLP, CASBs, firewalls, that sort of thing, so they can read these classifications and essentially enforce the appropriate controls. So we're running a bit short of time, so I might go to the next slide, Chris. So remediation, this is something we see organisations struggle a lot with. So a graph on the right there, you can see the data, the volume of data growth, it actually doubles every 3 years, right? So if you think of the data your organisation holds now, this, including sensitive data, it's probably going to be twice that in about 3 years' time. And the reason for that is it's essentially storage is really cheap. We're all in the digital age now. We're in the age of what I call digital hoarding, right? Where storage is so cheap that we just keep adding and adding and adding without bothering to go and clean up the data and remove that obsolete data. I mean, how many people on this webinar have maybe cleaned up their home drives of their organisation, right? And if you have, you'd know it's a really big task. And so it's something that often gets left behind. If we go to the next slide, you'd see that there's, I'm missing a slide, that's right. So there's...
Sorry, did you want that one?
Yeah. So there's some really important benefits of doing that remediation. So we can, when we talk about data breaches, right, if someone gets access to an organisation and the data's there, they can potentially access that data. But if the data is not there in the first place, then there's nothing for them to access. So actually performing the remediation is almost the best way to protect your data, right? Also from a discoverability perspective, as Chris mentioned, that reducing that footprint reduces risk from e-discovery perspective. And at the beginning of the webinar, I mentioned that about 2/3 of organisational data that they're holding is just it's redundant, it's old. So we really should be taking the time to remove that, because it's presenting all the risk from a data breach and a regulatory compliance perspective, but it's not giving us any of that benefit at all. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to just give you a bit of an idea of what remediation might look like. So there's tools out there that can do all this remediation, really in an automated fashion. So it's not something that someone has to sit there and constantly look at. But we can do things like, if I give you an example of, say there's HR data, and an organisation has a policy that all HR data needs to sit in the HR file share. Then if we see through a discovery that there's data sitting outside of that, we can automatically move that data to the right location. We can delete it, mask it, redact it. We can even do custom actions. So it's sort of like limitless in what we can actually do with the data. So that gives you an idea of what remediation might look like in your organisation.
Okay, so Nick touched on integration a bit, so we'll talk about this just for a second. Once that you have a foundation of understanding what your data is and where it is, what we find is many organisations then leverage that foundation to integrate with other systems, and typically that's things like CASB's email, DLP, and those sorts of systems, and even IDM. So once you understand that application holds more sensitive data, or that folder on a share drive, or that SharePoint, so whatever it might be, it means that you can then use that power to say, okay, for data ledger, I know I need my from an IDM perspective, I know those folks need access to that. It means from a data leakage perspective, I know I've automated my classification. So when an email pops up into when a file pops up into an email to send out, hey, remind the user, hey, did you really want to send that out to that Gmail address? That's a simplistic example, but it's pretty common. And so those sorts of integrations are really important, and particularly from where it touches the users, the user base in the organisation. That's layering that security awareness side of things as well. Just in terms of the users in DLP, as I talked about, one of the common places to integrate is DLP, and then you start to get some activity monitoring. And as I mentioned before, most data breaches are inadvertent activity by users, people simply trying to do their job. Very, very small fraction of users are malicious, but these sorts of understanding what the data is, where it is, integrating with other systems, again, it's very cost effective, and it means you're leveraging the power of all your tools instead of just 10 to 15%. But it means you can start to identify those systemic control failures. You can start to tweak your controls so that your staff's life is actually easier. It's easier to do their job, but it's much more secure. So that we've flown through that. I will send this pitch out to the folks on the call. If there's any questions, certainly feel free to ask them now. I'm happy to answer questions now. If you just type them in, and we can answer them now. Or give Nicholas, I'll send you our details, Nicholas and myself, our details, and feel free to give us a call. or ping us on LinkedIn or email, whatever works for you. Always happy to answer questions. We get, as I said when we started, we get questions every day about data governance and how to manage sensitive data and what to do with the various technologies. So happy to just spend half an hour on the phone just walking you through some stuff. That's always easy. More than happy to do that, and Nick, I'm sure, is happy to do the same. But if there's no questions, we'll end it there. And as I said, I'll send the pitch out. Please feel free to contact us, and always happy to answer some questions. We have one question actually, which we'll just answer quickly. The question is, do you have a view on classifying documents for sensitivity, and should it be done by machine or human? That's a great point. This is one we get a lot. We advocate automated file classification, and the reason we do is because as well-meaning as users might be in terms of classifying information, they will often misclassify it because they don't understand the classification policy. It might be too complex. Rather than just the 4 modes of classification, there might be more. We've seen up to a dozen types of classification for files at times in organisations, which is just overly complex. But where you allow people to do it, they'll often not get it quite right, or they might get it wrong intentionally because it might be a confidential document that they really want to email out, but they know if they classify it as confidential that they can't do what they want with it. So sometimes it's working around the system as well. So we're big advocates of automatically classifying documents, and almost in real time as the documents are being generated, they're being classified, because it keeps the system and the data governance program really robust.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's sort of 2 things you have to consider there. One is the legacy data, so the data that's already existing in the environment, in addition to the data that's being created, as Chris said, on the fly. So you have to be able to cater for both of those scenarios, and of course accuracy is another really important point. When we're automatically classifying, we want to make sure that the classification is as accurate as possible.
That's a good point. It's just another question about tools for classifying data there, and to your point, Nick, the most critical thing is accuracy. So an organisation and the staff in an organisation will quickly lose confidence with a program if it's not very accurate. So we aim, where we're doing classification, we aim for about a 99% accuracy, whereas we know there's some technologies out there which we can talk about offline. Feel free to talk about offline, but that are more of a 60-65% accuracy, and that's no good, because it means that your whole program starts to break down, and that just means the organisation loses confidence.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are another question. There are some data models out there, so there are some which we didn't cover today because we didn't have time, but certainly happy to talk offline. There are some models that you would, from an organisational perspective, that you would follow, from the executive down to data managers and staff at the lower level, that you would follow, that are pretty much best practice, and we can talk about those offline with people. Happy to chat about that. And I think that might be it. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Really great to be able to present this to you all. As I said, we'll send this pitch out, and Nick and I are always happy to answer questions. So just reach out.
Great. Thanks so much for joining.
Next time. Bye bye.
See ya.